If June 6, 1944, was the moment Dwight D. Eisenhower stood at the zenith of his power and confidence, then to understand the man who made that decision, we must turn the clock back to November 1942. Before there was the glory of Normandy, there had to be the chaos and the bloody lessons of North Africa. Operation Torch was not merely the first major amphibious assault of the war for the Western Allies. It was a brutal crucible for a general who had never led troops into battle and for an American army that was young, enthusiastic, and heartbreakingly naive. The story begins not on the sun-drenched beaches of the Mediterranean, but deep inside the damp, sunless bowels of the Rock of Gibraltar. In the first days of November 1942, Eisenhower established his headquarters inside this natural fortress guarding the gateway to the Atlantic. The air in the subterranean tunnels was thick with the smell of diesel fumes, stale cigarette smoke, and ancient limestone dust. Water dripped ceaselessly from the cave ceiling, creating a dismal soundtrack to the anxiety gnawing at Ike's mind. At this moment, he was not yet a legend. He was merely a lieutenant general, a man who had been promoted over the heads of hundreds of senior officers and was now tasked with commanding proud British admirals and American soldiers who had never heard a shot fired in anger. The pressure resting on his shoulders took a different shape than it would on D-Day. If Normandy was a straight-up gunfight with the Nazis, Operation Torch was a political minefield. The enemy waiting for them on the shores of Morocco and Algeria was not the Wehrmacht, but the French army of the Vichy government, soldiers who had once been allies. Men who were now serving a puppet regime that had shaken hands with Hitler. The question that haunted Eisenhower during his sleepless nights in the Gibraltar caves was not about strategy, but about psychology. Would the French embrace them or kill them? Would they allow the Americans to land, or would they turn the beaches into a slaughterhouse to defend their wounded national honor? The order issued to the armada of 650 ships silently cutting through the Atlantic waves was a strange contradiction. Do not fire unless fired upon. Imagine the tension of the farm boys from Ohio and Texas, standing on the heaving decks, gripping their M1 Garand, staring into the black void of the coastline, not knowing if the men waiting in the darkness would kiss them or put a bullet in their chests. In the pre-dawn hours of November 8, 1942, the gamble began. Operation Torch was divided into three massive spearheads: the Western Task Force aiming for Casablanca in Morocco, the Center Task Force aiming for Oran, and the Eastern Task Force aiming for Algiers. On the Atlantic coast of Morocco, the Western Task Force, under the command of General George S. Patton, the most aggressive and bloodthirsty warrior in the American arsenal, met its first enemy, the ocean itself. The sea was violent, with massive swells lifting the landing craft and smashing them down like toys. But worse was waiting. The hope that the French would not fire shattered the moment the sun broke the horizon. At Casablanca, the coastal fortress of El Henk and the French battleship Jean Bart opened fire. Although the Jean Bart was incomplete and moored statically at the dock, her massive 15-inch guns were operational. Her roar tore the sky apart, sending shells weighing nearly a ton hurtling toward the American fleet. The sea erupted into geysers of water dyed yellow by cordite. In response, the battleship USS Massachusetts, a modern steel monster, swung her turrets and unleashed a rain of fire upon the Casablanca harbor. It was a tragic, fratricidal gunfight between sailors who had fought on the same side in the First World War. Above, American Wildcat fighters tangled in dogfights with French WWII aircraft. Spirals of smoke marking the death of old friendships. Meanwhile, on the beaches, the chaos of a Green Army began to show. American troops landed miles off target. Light tanks bogged down in the soft sand. Radios were soaked in salt water and failed instantly. Young soldiers, tasting combat for the first time, ran confused under machine gun fire, looking desperately for their officers. Patton, trapped on the command ship Augusta by the high surf, screamed into his radio, pounding the railing in frustration as he watched his boys flounder on the sand. When he finally stormed ashore, with his ivory-handled pistols on his hips, Patton waded into the surf, kicking soldiers who were cowering in the sand, lifting their spirits with a stream of profanity that was as shocking as it was effective. But the true tragedy unfolded at the port of Oran in Algeria. In a daring attempt to seize the harbor facilities intact, two old British cutters, HMS Walney and HMS Heartland, packed with American commandos, made a suicidal dash directly into the harbor boom defenses. It was a mission straight into the mouth of hell. The moment they broke the boom chains, searchlights from the shore blinded them, turning the ships into glowing targets in the night. French artillery opened up from point-blank range. HMS Walney caught fire like a floating torch, drifting uncontrollably while her decks turned into an abattoir. Hundreds of American commandos were cut down before their boots could touch the pier. It was the high price of naivety, of underestimating the French resolve to fight. Eisenhower, receiving the casualty reports in his damp cave in Gibraltar, went silent. He realized then that the first lesson of war is always written in blood. However, it was not all disaster. At Algiers, the resistance was lighter, thanks to the clandestine work of diplomat Robert Murphy and a daring coup by the local French resistance. The Allies secured the city relatively quickly, but it was here that Eisenhower faced the most controversial political decision of his career. A choice that nearly buried his reputation before it had a chance to shine. While gunfire still crackled across North Africa, Eisenhower realized that if he continued to fight to destroy every French unit, he would waste precious time and allow the Germans to rush reinforcements into Tunisia. He needed an immediate ceasefire, and the only man who could order that was Admiral François Darlan, the commander-in-chief of the Vichy military, who happened to be in Algiers visiting his sick son. The problem was that Darlan was viewed as a traitor, a fascist collaborator who had worked with Hitler, a man despised by the free world. Eisenhower stood at a crossroads: arrest Darlan and continue a bloody war of attrition against the French, or shake hands with the devil to save the lives of thousands of American soldiers? In a smoke-filled room in Algiers, Eisenhower, his face gaunt and eyes dark with exhaustion after 3 days without sleep, chose the path of pragmatism. He signed the deal with Darlan, in exchange for Darlan ordering all French forces in North Africa to lay down their arms. Eisenhower recognized him as the head of the civil government there. The decision instantly triggered a political firestorm. The press in America and Britain branded Eisenhower as a man who sold his soul to fascists. Politicians in Washington and London demanded his relief. They screamed, "Are we fighting for freedom? Or are we compromising with collaborators?" Eisenhower, isolated in the eye of the storm, wrote a terse message to his superiors: "I did this to save the lives of soldiers. Their blood is more important than my reputation." And history proved him right. Darlan's ceasefire held. The French guns fell silent. Morocco and Algeria fell to the Allies in days instead of months. But the relief was short-lived. As the French laid down their rifles, the real enemy arrived. Hitler, enraged by the Vichy betrayal, poured German troops into neighboring Tunisia. This was the moment the American army, those boys who had just survived the confusion of the beaches, had to face the most experienced war machine in the world, the Afrika Korps and their legendary Tiger tanks. In late November 1942, the race to Tunisia began in the mud and cold rain. American soldiers, still wearing thin summer uniforms, began to taste the bitterness of continental warfare. They learned to dig foxholes not for practice, but to survive the terrifying crack of German 88mm artillery. They learned that their Stuart and Grant tanks were as fragile as eggshells against the German panzers. The Battle of Kasserine Pass, which would follow in February 1943, would be the most painful humiliation. But the seeds of that struggle were sown in the chaotic days of Operation Torch. Eisenhower, the desk general, had to learn how to manage massive egos like Patton and Montgomery, how to endure the savagery of public opinion, and most importantly, how to accept that a plan on paper never survives the first contact with the enemy. When we look back at Operation Torch, we do not see the polished perfection of propaganda films. We see capsized landing craft, lost paratroopers, tragic gunfights with the French, and dirty political deals, but it was in this chaotic blast furnace that the raw iron of the American army began to be forged into steel. The soldiers who survived the beaches of Morocco and Algeria shed their innocence to become hardened warriors. And Dwight D. Eisenhower, the man who had huddled in the Gibraltar tunnels, sick with worry over weather reports, emerged from North Africa as a true supreme commander. Torch was not the prettiest victory, but it was the most necessary one. As Prime Minister Winston Churchill famously said after hearing of the operation's success, "This is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end, but it is, perhaps, the end of the beginning." As the sun set over the North African harbors in late November 1942, with the American flag snapping in the wind beside the tricolor of Free France, Eisenhower knew the road to Berlin was still long, but at least they had set foot on the path. He folded his map of North Africa, lit a fresh cigarette, and turned his gaze across the Mediterranean, toward the boot of Italy and the fortress Europe waiting beyond. The bloody lessons of Torch would be the baggage he carried to Sicily, and eventually to the destiny that awaited him on the beaches of Normandy.